Hey folks, this is Tennessee State Senator Bo Watson. Do you ever feel like state politics are hard to follow? Do you wish you could hear directly from the people making the decisions? Do you really know what your elected officials are doing, the policies they're pushing, and how those choices impact your community and your daily life? Tennessee Today is a podcast where I share an inside look at state government, what's happening, why it matters, how it affects you in your daily life. No political spin here, no confusing jargon, just real discussions about the issues shaping our state. Welcome to Tennessee Today. In our last episode, we talked about why I'm doing this podcast, and I tried to give you a little bit of understanding of who I am and how I got to be involved in politics and how I got elected to the Tennessee General Assembly, first the House in 2004 and then the Senate in 2006. We talked a little bit about my background in healthcare as a practicing physical therapist for over 40 years. In this episode, I'd like to talk about the current legislative session that we're in that began in January of 2025, how legislative sessions are structured, how long they last, why they're structured that way, and then begin the conversation about the key issues that the legislature has been wrestling with this year. So buckle up, put on your seatbelt, batten down the hatches. We're going to talk about what happens in the legislature, which is always exciting stuff. So the Tennessee General Assembly, by the Tennessee State's Constitution, is required to go into session the second Tuesday in January. Whatever the date of the month that happens to be, it's always the second Tuesday. We go in at 12 noon and we tell the governor that we're in session. The House goes into one chamber and the Senate goes into the other chamber. Now, for those of you who may not be steeped in Tennessee state government, our government is set up the same way that the federal government's set up, quite frankly. As a matter of fact, we talked in the last session about how important state government is. Did you realize that the federal government is actually a creation by the state government? And did you realize that the local government is also a creation of state government? So, in fact, the primary source of government in the United States is the state government. The states came together and formed a federal government. They signed a contract with each other to say, hey, we'll all work together to have a larger federal system. But it was the states that created our federal government. And then on the local level, any city that wants to be created or has a charter, that charter has to be approved by the state government. And the county government is a creation of the state government. As a matter of fact, the county government, and few people realize this, the county government is the state government at the local level. For example, the city of Chattanooga. The city of Chattanooga is created by a charter. They don't have to have a jail. They don't have to have a health department. They don't have to have an education system. They may choose to have those, but they don't have to have those. The county government, on the other hand, has to have a jail, has to have an education system, has to have a health department because the state has to have an education system, has to have a prison system or correction system, has to have an educational system and a health system. So the state government and the county government are the same as each other, just one at the local level and the other at the state level. Kind of got off topic there, sorry, but I think it's really important for folks to understand how important state government really is and that the creation of our entire federal system is a creation from the state. So oftentimes you will see states pushing back against the federal government. As a matter of fact, many people believe that our federal government is acting outside of its constitutional limits. The Constitution of the United States limits what the government can do. And most of the responsibilities of the government are not the responsibilities of the federal government. They're the responsibilities of the state government. Now, real quickly, before I get back to how our government is structured, a great analogy to look at that's in the news today is the Department of Education at the federal level. Now, education is mentioned nowhere in the United States Constitution. Nowhere. It is mentioned in the Tennessee State Constitution. So education is actually a responsibility of the states, not a responsibility of the federal government. Can the federal government play a role in education? Sure they can, if the states choose to allow them to play a role. What we're seeing right now is a tension that exists, a natural tension between the state government and the federal government, where the federal government, in many people's opinion, has gone beyond its role by having this large Department of Education that is trying to tell the states how they're supposed to do education. The states would say, that's not a constitutional right that you have. The states are responsible for that. So this current administration, the Trump administration, is stepping back in history, so to speak, and saying education for most of this country's existence has been a responsibility of the states, not of the federal government, and we're going to take the power that has somehow been sucked into the federal system and give it back to the states. Now, we'll talk about that in a later episode and what that all means, but that's just an example of how our three different levels of government, local, state, and federal, all kind of interact with each other, with ultimately, in most instances, the state being the biggest decision maker of those things. Now, back to how we are structured. So everybody's familiar, we have an executive branch, which is the President of the United States. We have a legislative branch, which is the U.S. Congress and their Senate. And we have a judicial branch, which everybody sees as the Supreme Court. Interestingly enough, since the states set up the federal government, states are structured the same way. In Tennessee, we have an executive branch, which is the governor. Governor Bill Lee is our current chief executive officer. We have a judicial branch. We have a Tennessee State Supreme Court made up of 5 justices who have responsibility for reviewing and interpreting the Constitution and its relation to state laws. And we have a legislature, which is made up of both a House and a Senate, just like the federal system. In Tennessee state government, our House has 99 members. Our state has 33 members. Our Constitution, the state's Constitution, sets up how our legislature is structured. And in our Constitution, it says the Senate shall always be 1/3 the size of the House. So no matter how big the House gets based on population, the Senate is always 1/3. So if we ever expand our state House to 300 members, the Senate would be limited to 100 members. That means that a Senate member's vote has 3 times the effectiveness of a House member's vote. That also means that a Senate member has 3 times as much geographical or responsibility as a House member has. So it's important to understand when bills are in the House or bills are in the Senate, how many people are engaged in that process. Because the Senate is a little bit smaller, it tends to be a little more collegial with each other. We have perhaps deeper relationships with our fellow members, whereas the House, when you have 99 members, it's a little bit harder to develop some of those relationships, and you can get some caucuses or some fracturing in the caucus because there are just so many other members with so many other different opinions. Also, House members tend to have more opinions because when there are 99 members, you have to scream a little bit louder to be heard. When there are only 33 members, you don't have to scream quite as loudly to be heard. Anyway, we go into session the second Tuesday of every January to start a session. Now, session lasts 2 years. So this past January, we began the 114th General Assembly. We call our legislature the General Assembly. We're the 114th. That means since 1796, when the great state of Tennessee was founded, we have had 114 unique legislative sessions. They last 2 years. House members are elected for 2 years. Their lifetime in the legislature is 2 years before they have to be reelected. A Senate member's lifetime is 4 years, which means a Senate member gets 2 legislative sessions before they have to stand for reelection. By the way, I'm up for reelection in 2026. That will be my 4-year cycle. So this 114th is the last session before I stand for reelection again. We come back into session and we spend the first couple of weeks just getting organized. Who's going to be in what committee, who's going to be chairman of what committee, where you get to park, where your office is. You got to get your ID made, get your picture made. got to meet all the commissioners and all the people that work in the executive branch. So the first week or so of any legislative session is really just getting organized, particularly when you're a new member. You're trying to figure out where each door goes and where each hallway leads to. Once we finish the organizational session, then we typically get into regular session. But this year was unique. When we adjourned from the organizational session, the governor called us into a special session, which is a unique session of the legislature. Now, the Constitution allows the governor to call the legislature into special session. It also allows the legislature to call itself into special session. When we go into special session, we can only talk about a limited number of topics. This year, we went into special session to discuss really two key topics. One was education and the governor's proposal for educational choice, his Freedom Education Act, and to talk about some immigration policies. We'll talk a lot more about that later. We were in special session for about a week. We passed some new laws out of that special session, and then we began what is known as the regular session, which will last usually from the second Tuesday in January to sometime either in late April or early May, where we will adjourn for the summer session and come back again the next second Tuesday of January in the following year. That is the legislative life cycle. So here's a fact that the governor doesn't want you to know. In Tennessee, the power of government rests in the legislature. People often think, they think about the United States Congress and how the president can veto a piece of legislation that the Congress has passed and how difficult it can be to override a president's veto. But in state government, or at least in the state of Tennessee, our Constitution gives the power to the legislature because we can override a governor's veto with a simple majority. Now, why is that important? Well, a bill doesn't even get passed unless it has a majority. So even before the governor vetoes a piece of legislation, the legislature has already passed that legislation with enough votes to override the governor's veto, unless the governor can convince enough members to change their vote. Members do not like to change their votes. It confuses their constituents, it confuses the public, and it makes them look indecisive. So typically, once a bill is passed the legislature, governors have really two options. They can sign it and comes into law, or they can choose not to sign it and give an explanation of why they didn't sign it, but it still becomes law. So Thomas Jefferson said after 1796, and there have been a lot of other states, we were the 16th state to come along, so there have been a lot of other states that have come past since us. But at the time, Thomas Jefferson said the best state constitution that has ever been written was the 1796 Tennessee State Constitution. We amended that constitution again in 1834, and then we amended it again following the Civil War in 1869. We are still operating under the Constitution, the state of Tennessee of 1869, which by and large still reflects the Constitution from 1796. Now, the legislature, of course, we have the House and the Senate that we've discussed. Within the House and the Senate, the body of work, the division of labor, so to speak, is divided amongst different committees. In the Senate, and I'll speak to the Senate because that's where I've spent most of my time, but the House isn't unlike the Senate. The Senate has 9 standing committees which deal with different subject matters. So when someone has an idea and we put it on paper, we will call that a bill. When a person has a bill, that bill is about some kind of subject matter. Maybe it's about education. Maybe it's about health care. Maybe it's about law enforcement. Whatever its subject matter is, it will be assigned to a committee. In the Senate, there are 9 standing committees with between 9 and 11 members on each standing committee. For example, I'm on 3 committees. I'm chairman of the Senate Finance Ways and Means Committee, which is the largest committee. I have 11 members. I'm also on the Health and General Welfare Committee, which has 9 members. And I'm on the Commerce and Insurance Committee, which has 9 members. So any kind of bill dealing with insurance, I will see it in my committee. There's also a Judiciary Committee, a State and Local Committee, a Transportation Committee, an Environment and Energy Committee, and a Government Operations Committee, as well as an Education Committee, which is really a critical committee since the largest function of state government is typically education. For you to understand how state government operates, you have to understand, appreciate, and value and respect the committee system. Most of the decisions on pieces of legislation are going to be made at the committee level. Once a bill comes out of a committee or out of multiple committees and makes its way to the Senate or the House floor, it has been amended or it has been fixed to be passable on the House floor or on the Senate floor, meaning that a member is not going to bring a bill to the full Senate or to the full House unless that member feels like they have 17 votes in the Senate, which is required to pass a bill in the Senate, or 50 votes in the House, which is required for a bill to pass in the House. So understanding and appreciating and working within the committee system gives an idea or gives the bill, a bill, the best opportunity for passage. It also is the best opportunity to have a bill defeated. We will have introduced into the Tennessee General Assembly somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 different bills. Only about 600 to 800 of those bills will actually become law, which means the majority of those bills will never leave the committee system. So for you to understand where you engage yourself in our political process in Tennessee, you have to understand and know who the committee's members are, where they're from, what their interests are, and why a particular issue may or may not be of interest to them. And in communicating with your state government, you want to communicate with your legislative members at the committee level. Don't wait until it gets to the floor of the House or Senate to weigh in. So now you understand how we're structured. You know, we have the governor, the House, the Senate, and of course the judicial branch with the Supreme Court. And you understand that the power rests in the legislature, and you understand that the division of labor in both the House and the Senate is divided amongst committee. You need to then begin to appreciate what are the issues that the Tennessee General Assembly, the House and the Senate are considering this year. Many times those issues will come to us from the governor. Governors have the responsibility to somewhat set the legislative agenda for the legislature, but they don't own the legislature's agenda. The legislature will eventually develop its own agenda, but the governor gives us a template. This year, the key issues that we're really looking at, immigration has become a really big issue at the state level. Now, earlier, we had talked about how there is this tension that exists between the state and the federal government. And the Constitution of the United States, not the Constitution of the state of Tennessee, but the Constitution of the United States, really gives the authority and the responsibility for immigration policy and law to the federal government. That is one place that the United States Constitution explicitly gives responsibility to the federal government, and that's immigration. But over the past 30 or 40 years, our federal government has just had an inability to deal with our immigration situation. It really predates Ronald Reagan. It goes back really into the 70s, where our system of government has struggled with how do we deal with the amount of immigration coming in to our country. That failure to address the problem has started to tax or stress our state's financial systems, our ability to afford the immigration, both legal and illegal, that is coming into the states, as well as the drug problem that often comes along with it. So in the past 5 years, you have really seen states start to try and be helpful to our federal system around immigration policy. Again, laws and policy for immigration are really a responsibility of the federal government, but that doesn't mean that states can't play a role. So this year you will see, and we'll talk about in later episodes, some of the immigration ideas that states like Tennessee are starting to put forward. And we have a large number of immigration bills that have been introduced in the Tennessee Senate and House this year. A key topic that we always deal with is education, particularly K-12 education, but we also deal with higher education, corrections, which really revolves around public safety. How do we ensure, government's fundamental responsibility? I mean, governments, if you go back and read the Declaration of Independence from Thomas Jefferson, governments, people form governments predominantly to protect life, liberty, and their ability to pursue happiness. Well, protection means safety. So government's primary responsibility to its citizens that created it is really to try and create safe environments. So you'll see the legislature talk a lot about public safety and how do we deal with public safety and how do we deal with those who refuse to obey the laws. How do we deal with that? There are a lot of pieces of legislation around that issue. And then the most important thing that we do, however, at the state level is our state budget. As a matter of fact, the Constitution of the state of Tennessee only requires us to pass one solitary bill, and that's the bill that funds our state government, which we call the budget. Now, there are a lot of other things we do, but the Constitution doesn't tell us we have to do that. The Constitution of the state of Tennessee does tell us you have to pass a state budget, and most importantly, it has to be balanced. So unlike our federal government, and again, this is a current event, we saw the federal government pass a continuing resolution. They haven't passed a budget at the federal level in years. We are required to pass a balanced budget every year in the state of Tennessee. And that is my primary responsibility as chairman of the Finance Committee. I have the awesome task, the awesome responsibility, and quite frankly, the humbling responsibility of shepherding and passing a state budget that funds the things that Tennesseans are most interested in, but also preserves the financial integrity of our state. And so you'll hear me talk a lot about fiscal policy on this podcast because it is the one thing that our Constitution requires us to do, is to be fiscally responsible, pass a balanced budget, and pass a budget every year. I hope you learned something interesting today. As a matter of fact, if you did learn something, I hope you'll share this podcast with your friends and neighbors. But more importantly, I hope you will engage in the conversation. You can ask me questions or give me topic ideas. I'm easy to reach at info@bofortn.com. That's BOFORTN.com.